In an earlier video, we traced the evolution of the struggle for civil rights for African Americans from the founding through the 1930s. In this video, we're going to explore the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and consider its legacy. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get to it. But to understand that movement, we need to understand what's going on in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s, most notably the impact of the end of World War II. Over 1 million African Americans served in various capacities during the war. Their service, often in segregated units, highlighted the paradox of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied rights at home. The experiences of African American veterans and their increased expectations for civil rights played a pivotal role in energizing the movement. The paradox was highlighted by the Double V campaign. Initiated by the Pittsburgh Courier, a leading African American newspaper, the Double V campaign directly connected the struggle for victory over fascism abroad with the need to end racism at home. In doing so, it galvanized African Americans to fight for civil rights as part of their contribution to the war effort. The Cold War context also reinforced this contradiction. As the United States sought to promote democracy and freedom around the world, it faced criticism for racial discrimination at home. And actors in the U.S. government recognized that segregation and racial injustice were hindering the U.S.'s global standing, particularly its competition with the Soviet Union for influence in the decolonizing world. The inequality experienced by African Americans in the post-war period was not just political. The post-war economic boom and the growth of the middle class did not equally benefit African Americans, who increasingly faced job discrimination and economic disparities, contributing to the demand for civil rights. And so it's in this context that the civil rights movement was re-energized, pursuing a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, activists pursued a legal strategy to demand progressive realization of racial equity in the United States. Largely spearheaded by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and its Legal Defense and Education Fund, and argued by lawyers like Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first African American to be appointed as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, the legal strategy was a critical component of the broader struggle for racial equality by challenging segregation and discrimination through the court system. Perhaps the most well-known of these cases was Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This landmark Supreme Court decision declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional, overturning the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling that had established the separate but equal doctrine. This case was pivotal in dismantling sanctioned racial segregation in education. But there were numerous other cases of importance, the earliest of which was Smith v. Alright, in which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that white-only primaries in Texas were unconstitutional. White primaries restricted political participation to whites only, effectively ensuring they retained political control and preventing candidates who might challenge racist institutions from getting on the ballot. Ending the process helped to ensure the progressive realization of black voting rights. In Shelley v. Kramer, the Supreme Court held that racially restrictive housing covenants were not enforceable in court, which was a step towards ending legally sanctioned racial discrimination in housing. In Morgan v. Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled that Virginia's state law enforcing segregation on interstate buses was unconstitutional, an early victory against segregation in interstate travel. And in one of the most accurately named cases in U.S. Supreme Court history, the court's decision in the case of Loving v. Virginia declared that state laws prohibiting interracial marriage were unconstitutional, thereby ending all race-based legal restrictions on marriage in the United States. The NAACP's strategy was often characterized by a gradual approach, targeting specific instances of inequality and building a series of legal precedents covering specific areas like education, housing, transportation, and political participation. But over time, these cases cumulatively undermined the legal foundation of segregation and discrimination. They also helped to set the stage for legislative action by highlighting the need for federal laws to enforce civil rights, and the legal strategy played a crucial role in raising public awareness about issues of segregation and racial discrimination. But the legal strategy was accompanied by a broader political strategy to force movement on the issue of civil rights and equal protection. That movement centered on a strategy of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience, refusing to comply with unjust laws and responding passively to aggression or violence. Activists faced arrest, violence, and ostracism, but were willing to endure such retaliation in order to draw attention and sway public opinion, with the ultimate goal of garnering broad support from the public and the government to end legal discrimination and segregation. The strategy of civil disobedience began with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. The boycott was sparked when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. The boycott lasted over a year and resulted in the desegregation of the Montgomery public bus system. It also marked the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a prominent civil rights leader. The boycott highlighted the growing economic power of the black community. The Montgomery bus system relied heavily on African American passengers, who comprised upward of 3/4 of the system's passengers. The boycott placed a huge strain on the bus system, ultimately forcing its desegregation. A few years later, student activists in Greensboro, North Carolina, sought to desegregate lunch counters at Woolworths and other stores in the city. The protesters would sit at the whites-only lunch counter and wait to be served. When denied service and ordered to leave, they would refuse, enduring harassment and arrest. These sit-ins spread and were effective in desegregating many public facilities. Indeed, an estimated 70,000 people ultimately participated in sit-ins aimed at desegregating restaurants and other public accommodations. Again, by utilizing their economic power and willingness to face detention and arrest, protesters drew attention to the injustices they faced, ultimately forcing the desegregation of lunch counters and other public accommodations. The Greensboro Sit-ins were particularly important both as the first and thus an important symbolic inspiration for similar protests elsewhere in the South and in the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. In the spring and summer of 1961, the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, organized groups of activists to ride interstate buses into the segregated South to challenge non-enforcement of Supreme Court rulings that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. Freedom riders faced brutal violence, but protest rides ultimately led to the desegregation of interstate transportation facilities. In the summer of 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., launched their Birmingham campaign. The campaign sought to employ a wide range of nonviolent confrontations, marches, and sit-ins to protest segregation in one of the most racially divided cities in the South. The campaign faced violent responses from local authorities, drawing national attention and contributing to the push for civil rights legislation. That same year, King's group organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This massive rally in Washington, D.C., where Dr. King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech, was a high point of the civil rights movement, demonstrating widespread support for civil rights and economic equality. The next year, in 1964, Mississippi Freedom Summer brought more than 700 mostly white volunteers to Mississippi to register African American voters in the state. The campaign faced violence and intimidation, but significantly raised awareness about the suppression of black voting rights in the South. Finally, in the summer of 1965, protesters organized the Selma to Montgomery marches. The marches were pivotal in highlighting the denial of voting rights to African Americans. The first marches, known as Bloody Sunday, met with brutal police violence, but subsequent marches, protected by federal troops, successfully reached Montgomery and led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Each of these events demonstrated the power and effectiveness of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience in challenging systemic racism and injustice. They played crucial roles in galvanizing public opinion, influencing legislation, including leading to the passage of several key pieces of legislation. The 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment or in any federally funded program, and included provisions that reduced barriers to voting, prohibited discrimination in public accommodation and facilities. The 1965 Voting Rights Act aimed to overcome legal barriers to voting at the state and local level. It banned the use of literacy tests and other discriminatory barriers, provided for federal oversight of elections in jurisdictions with a history of discrimination, and authorized the deployment of federal examiners and observers to monitor elections. The Voting Rights Act had a dramatic impact on black political participation, leading to massive surges in registration and voting by African Americans. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, sometimes called the Civil Rights Act of 1968, prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, or national origin. These legislative actions were the result of the legal and political struggle for civil rights, but there were competing visions of how to conduct that struggle. Martin Luther King Jr.'s campaign centered on the use of nonviolent civil disobedience and was strongly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. King believed that peaceful protests, marches, and boycotts would ultimately be successful in integrating African Americans into all aspects of American society. Indeed, one of King's most well-known speeches, his I Have a Dream speech, speaks powerfully of a nation where people will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. King's background as a Baptist minister meant that his philosophy was deeply rooted in Christian ethics, emphasizing love, forgiveness, and redemption. And this gave King a broad appeal, which he tried to use to build a coalition of diverse supporters, including whites, to support the cause of civil rights. He believed in appealing to the moral conscience of the nation and worked within existing political and social structures. But even King's comparatively moderate message was often met by resistance and hostility, and King himself was gunned down outside the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968, just a few months after delivering his dream speech. But others in the black community were arguing for a more direct and confrontational approach. Most well known among these were Malcolm X and later the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Malcolm X's strategy centered on black empowerment and self-defense. Rather than integration into white society, Malcolm advocated for black nationalism and separatism. Even as his views moderated later in his life, Malcolm X always emphasized the importance of black self-reliance and self-defense. Malcolm X's approach was characterized by a direct and unflinching confrontation against racial injustice. He was critical of white America's role in systemic oppression of black people, and his arguments drew on Islamic principles arising from his religious views. Malcolm also sought to internationalize the plight of African Americans and connect their struggle with broader global movements against colonialism and oppression. And we can get a sense of his views by looking at the text of some of his speeches. Unlike King's speeches and letters, which often highlight the strategy of nonviolent resistance, Malcolm X speeches take on a more confrontational tone. While King is giving speeches like I Have a Dream and writing powerful letters from a Birmingham jail, Malcolm is threatening the ballot or the bullet and arguing for liberation by any means necessary. Indeed, in one of his most famous speeches, Malcolm X argues that we're not Americans, we're Africans who happen to be in America. We were kidnapped and brought here against our will from Africa. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock, that rock landed on us. But just like King, Malcolm was killed by those who opposed his vision, assassinated on February 21, 1965, just before he was supposed to deliver a speech to the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And beyond the leadership that often receives considerable attention, thousands of other individuals played a critical role in the civil rights movement. Women in particular played a crucial and often under-recognized role in the movement. Women played key leadership roles in a variety of organizations. Ella Baker, for example, was a major figure in the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Daisy Bates played a leading role in the Little Rock integration crisis of 1957. Women were the backbone of grassroots organizing efforts, organizing the boycotts, voter registration drives, sit-ins, and marches that comprised the core strategy of the movement. Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, was instrumental in organizing Mississippi's Freedom Summer and co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Some women became powerful symbolic figures of the movement. Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, was a catalyst for the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and her act of defiance became a symbol of the struggle against segregation and racial injustice. Women contributed significantly to the intellectual underpinnings of the movement. Writers like Maya Angelou and Angela Davis used their platforms to speak out against racial injustice and articulate visions for change. And countless women were key in mobilizing community support for civil rights actions, organizing church meetings, preparing food for rallies, and providing shelter for traveling activists, all playing a vital role in sustaining the movement's momentum. But despite their contributions, women often faced gender discrimination within the movement itself. Their roles were sometimes marginalized, and they were frequently excluded from leadership positions. Nevertheless, the central and active role played by so many women in the civil rights struggle not only helped advance the cause of racial equity, but also paved the way for further advances in women's rights and social justice, which we consider in another video. But even as the struggle of so many in the civil rights movements was forcing the federal government to give ground and pass legislation expanding civil rights, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was actively working to undermine the movement. The most notable of these was COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, a series of covert and often illegal activities aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting domestic American political organizations involved in the civil rights movement. Initiated in 1956 by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover as a program to monitor and undermine the Communist Party of the United States, it quickly expanded to target a wide range of organizations and individuals deemed to be subversive or radical. Targets of the program included both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and many others involved in the civil rights, feminist, socialist, and anti-war groups of the day. The program was not just confined to surveillance. COINTELPRO used a variety of tactics, including wiretapping, infiltration by agents and informants, psychological warfare, harassment through the legal system, spreading of false reports and rumors, and even employing political violence, including assaults and beatings of activists. It also tried to promote conflict and violence within and between the organizations of the movement. These methods were often extra-legal and violated constitutional protections. The Black Panther Party was a particular target of COINTELPRO as it worked to undermine the party's leadership, create internal divisions, and erode public support for the group. COINTELPRO was exposed in 1971 when a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and released documents related to the program. The public revelation of COINTELPRO led to widespread outrage and investigations, including a full investigation by the United States Senate Church Committee. The Church Committee investigation concluded that through COINTELPRO and other related programs, the U.S. government had engaged in intelligence excesses at home and abroad, and that intelligence agencies have undermined constitutional rights of citizens, primarily because the checks and balances designed by the framers of the Constitution to assure accountability had not been applied. The report also concluded that the program involved a significant abuse of power, often violated constitutional rights of American citizens, frequently targeted groups engaged in lawful political activity, and failed to maintain any real degree of accountability or oversight of operations. A number of structural reforms and oversights of such intelligence programs were introduced as a result of the Church Committee report, including the development of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA courts, which we explore elsewhere in the course. But when all is said and done, the civil rights movement achieved several significant milestones that profoundly changed American society. Legal decisions like Brown v. Board of Education, Smith v. Alright, and others ended legal segregation and discrimination in the United States, even if de facto discrimination continued. Legislative action made employment and housing discrimination illegal and opened the political process to all. But equally importantly, the movement brought about a significant shift in American cultural attitudes regarding race and equality, raising national and international awareness of the struggles and injustices faced by African Americans, and making overt discrimination socially unacceptable. The movement also helped to expand African American political participation, leading to improved political representation for Black Americans at all levels of government. Finally, the strategies, tactics, and successes of the civil rights movement provided a model for other social justice movements in the United States and around the world. But even amidst these dramatic achievements, racial disparities persist in countless areas of American life, underscoring the ongoing struggle for civil rights and equality. In education, there remain significant resource disparities between schools in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods and those in poorer, often minority areas. Despite efforts to desegregate schools, many schools remain segregated along racial and economic lines due to housing patterns and other factors. This segregation often correlates with disparities in educational quality and outcomes, with students of color often lagging behind their white counterparts in academic achievement, a disparity evident in standardized test scores, high school graduation rates, and college enrollment and completion rates. Data also show that students of color, particularly African American and Hispanic students, are likely to face harsher disciplinary measures in school, including suspensions and expulsions. In the economy, unemployment rates are consistently higher for African Americans and Hispanics compared to whites, even when controlling for educational background, and significant wage disparities exist between white workers and workers of color, with the latter often earning less for the same work. Discrimination in hiring, promotions, and workplace culture continues to be a barrier for people of color, as they frequently face challenges in career advancement with fewer represented in managerial and executive positions. And in the criminal justice system, African Americans and Hispanic Americans are disproportionately likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested by police. They're more likely to be convicted than their white counterparts, and once convicted, tend to receive harsher sentences for similar crimes. Racial disparities are particularly evident in the application of the death penalty, with defendants of color having a higher likelihood of being sentenced to death for capital cases, especially those involving white victims. All that said, the civil rights movement was a critically important period in American political history. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.